This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 399 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Last week, I went through some of the players that I'm targeting in fantasy drafts this year. And today, the plan is to talk through players that I'm avoiding, or at least players I won't have a whole lot of exposure to this year. Like last week's episode, instead of giving you guys a list and just moving on, the plan is to talk through in detail why I feel the way I do about these players, to give detailed context. You know how I operate by now. It's almost episode 400. Now, before getting into those players, I want to remind you guys that NumberFire's premium subscription service has changed for the better. Instead of paying up to $49.99 a month on tools and expert analysis, the new premium package is just $9.99 for the same stuff. And some of the things that you had to pay for before are now free, like the Fantasy Football Draft Kit. You can actually see my rankings for free now too. So if you want sports betting and daily fantasy tools and don't want to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars, go to numberfire.com and sign up for premium for just $9.99 a month. And take a look at the Fantasy Football Draft Kit while you're there. So the first player I'm likely going to avoid this year isn't that much of a surprise. It's Lamar Jackson. I did an entire episode on Lamar Jackson and the late round quarterback strategy back on episode 377. So some of this is going to sound familiar. But here's why I'm not drafting Jackson in the second round this year. First off, he's not going to do what he did last year here in 2020. Probability, at least, is not on his side. We know that he has the ability to go nuts in fantasy given what he does on the ground. But what really catapulted him into being historic last year was his passing. He got you those points with his legs, and then his arm just put everything over the top. He finished the season with a 9% touchdown rate. That's touchdowns divided by attempts. That was the second highest rate in NFL history behind Peyton Manning's 2004 season. Of the 13 quarterbacks in league history with an 8% rate or better, none saw a touchdown rate increase the following year, and the average decline was 3%. Touchdown rate regresses. And if Jackson had the same number of pass attempts last year, but he had a 6% touchdown rate instead of a 9% touchdown rate, he would have thrown 12 fewer touchdowns. Now, some of those passing scores might have turned into rushing touchdowns, but the Ravens are also a team that's likely not going to score as many touchdowns as they did last year. They had 58 offensive touchdowns in 2020. We've seen 11 teams with next season data hit the 55 touchdown mark over the last 9 years, and of those teams, only one increased their touchdown total the following year. And the majority saw a pretty big decline. And that's generally true of 50 touchdown teams too. So even if Jackson were to keep up his rushing pace, I'm not convinced that he'd be able to find the end zone enough on the ground to maintain the same type of edge in fantasy football or close to it. There's just a lot coming in terms of regression. Now, I do still have him as my QB1. So this isn't really a complaint about Lamar Jackson projecting out to be one of the best quarterbacks in fantasy. It's mostly that without that huge edge, you're not getting nearly enough value out of Jackson since he plays quarterback. And quarterbacks don't hold that much value in fantasy football. This is really an opportunity cost thing. When you get Jackson in the second round, you're foregoing the opportunity to get really good running backs and wide receivers in that area of the draft. And given the research that I did this offseason on where league-winning players come from, that's a prime spot to get true difference makers in fantasy football. So many top running backs and wide receivers get drafted early for a reason. They hit at a much higher rate. It's not until you get into the fourth round of a 12-team league, historically at least, where you see a drop-off in hit rate. And by hit rate, I mean the rate in which you're hitting on a league-winning player. If you get to the fourth round and Lamar Jackson is still there, I can understand pouncing on Lamar Jackson at that point in the draft. But he's being drafted in the late second, and that's far too early for me. The position is replaceable. There's a huge supply of usable quarterbacks. You can stream the position. And historically, there's been very little correlation at the position between preseason expectation and postseason result. Late round quarterbacks will always be usable. Taking one early is just too risky given what you're missing out on when you make that pick. Jackson's the only quarterback that I'm going to talk about today, but you can make similar arguments for Mahomes if he's projected to go around Jackson in your draft. I have Mahomes as QB2, but the projection between him and Jackson is only like 4 points apart. So Jackson is my go-to fade, even though I just don't draft quarterbacks early in general. But let's move on to running back. And let's talk about a guy who holds a special place in my heart, and that's Aaron Jones. The reason he holds a special place in my heart is because I was really into him as a prospect, and then he ended up hitting. I love Aaron Jones. I just am a little bit worried about what's going to happen to his stat line this year. That's all this is about. We know that stat line was carried by touchdowns last season. He scored 19 freaking times. I've got a weighted touchdown metric for running backs that looks at yards to touchdowns, but also looks at how frequently backs are seeing highly important touches, like goal line touches. According to that statistic, Jones should have had 8.1 fewer touchdowns last year. If you don't want to believe my math, Mike Clay from ESPN has a metric called opportunity adjusted touchdowns, or OTD. And that weighs every carry and target to show how many touchdowns a player should have scored. And Jones should have had 8.2 fewer touchdowns last year according to OTD. So the two metrics really align. Mine just focuses on rushing touchdowns for the record. Now, since 2011, there have been 12 instances with next season data where a running back had 15 or more touchdowns. 11 of those instances saw a running back decrease his touchdowns per game the following year. Todd Gurley is the only one who didn't from 2017 to 2018. I would be shocked if Aaron Jones finds the end zone 19 times this year. But I do think one thing the fantasy community sometimes gets wrong is that regression doesn't automatically mean a player becomes irrelevant. Aaron Jones on 11 touchdowns last year instead of 19, he was still the RB10 in points per game. It's not like the dude sucked had he scored the number of times he should have scored based on math. And that's basically where he's being drafted right now, so I get it. I'm just worried about the forces working against Jones this year aside from regression. The Packers drafted A.J. Dillon, and we don't know exactly how he's going to dig into Aaron Jones' workload, especially Jones' workload at the goal line. Only 5 running backs had more goal line carries than Jones last year, and he tied Ezekiel Elliott for the most goal line touchdowns in the league. A.J. Dillon is a freak. He's huge. What if he takes on some of that role? The Packers were also fortunate to win a lot of close games last year. If they're worse, which they're projected to be according to FanDuel's Sportsbook, their over-under win total is 9, then that could lead to more negative game scripts. Maybe that'll help Jones's receiving numbers, and targets are more valuable than attempts at running back. But the Packers would likely see more passing touchdowns versus rushing touchdowns. And that would hurt Jones in fantasy. There's some correlation between pass-to-rush attempt ratio and pass-to-rush touchdown ratio. My projections aren't super far off from where Jones is being drafted. I just think that there are a lot of high upside backs in that area of the draft. And Jones is probably my least favorite in that tier. That's why I'm talking about him today. Another running back that I'm not very into at cost is Raheem Mostert. Historically, RB2s in fantasy football drafts are pretty bad bets. The RB13 to the RB24 group. Since 2011, we've seen them finish as top 12 running backs at a 17.6% rate. So they jump up to RB1 status 17.6% of the time. But they jump up to top 6 status just 4.6% of the time. When you look at RB25 to RB36 running backs, so the RB3s in your draft, their rate of being top 6 backs is about 3%. So it's really not that far off from what we see with RB2s. I'm not saying just blindly avoid that tier. Just know that history is not on that tier's side. That's an immediate knock on Raheem Mostert. But so is the fact that I think that people are just completely discounting 2 really big things that happened to Raheem Mostert last year. First is touchdowns. He scored a lot of touchdowns. Mike Clay's OTD metric had Mostert with 6.2 more touchdowns than he should have last year based on where he was seeing his touches. And then receiving is also an issue. He started playing more than half of the 49ers snaps in Week 13 last year. From that point on, so through Week 17, Mostert averaged a running back rush share per game of 62.3%. That's fine. But his target share per game was under 7%. He averaged just 1.8 targets per game. You may think that doesn't matter because he's seeing enough work on the ground in a good offense, but it does when we're talking about ceiling. Since 2011, only 5 running backs have finished in the top 10 in season-long PPR leagues while getting a sub 7% target share. That's a hit rate of 5.6%. And the only running back in that group who finished in the top 5 was Derrick Henry last year. If you're projecting Mostert to see a lot more work through the air, then great. You probably just disagree with this whole entire portion of this episode. You like him more than I do. I'm just concerned about that, especially since Tevin Coleman saw more work as a receiver last year. But we also can't forget that Coleman was the starter when things mattered most for the 49ers in the playoffs. In the divisional round, Coleman out-attempted Mostert 22-12, and he had a big game. And then he got hurt in the NFC Championship, so Mostert went off. And he did well. Like, I get why people like Raheem Mostert. It's a good offense, he fits the offense well, and he's really not a bad running back despite the long journey that he's been on in the NFL. But I do worry about banking on a 28-year-old late breakout running back as my RB2 when there are concerns about touchdown regression and pass catching. I see him more as someone who can meet and maybe slightly exceed ADP expectation rather than someone who's going to be a true league-winning player. And I want that upside with every single pick that I make. You could honestly take some of the things that I've already talked about on this episode and immediately understand why I'm not into Mark Ingram this year. Ingram's in that RB2 range where running backs don't hit at a super high rate, like I just talked about. You've got the Ravens offense likely regressing a bit with the number of touchdowns that they're going to score. Like Aaron Jones, Ingram scored 15 touchdowns last year, so based on the logic for Aaron Jones, that applies for Mark Ingram as well. And given all of that, Ingram did overperform last year in the touchdown column. Mathematically, he did. He scored 5 receiving touchdowns on just 30 targets. That's the first time any running back in NFL history has done that. The average running back over the last decade has scored through the air on every 37 targets. Mark Ingram was doing that last year on every 6 targets. Touchdown regression is coming. But Ingram's peripheral numbers weren't even that good last year. On a per-game basis, he ranked 27th best at running back in percentage of running back rushes for his team. And he was 41st in per-game target share. The reason he was able to finish as a top 10 back last year was because of situation, period. But that situation is likely going to change. Not just because Baltimore probably won't be as efficient offensively, but J.K. Dobbins is there now. Dobbins isn't going to do nothing to Ingram's workload. So I don't really get Ingram's RB24 price tag. I think it's too rich. The wide receiver market this year just seems really efficient. It's sort of similar to how I feel about quarterback. I think ADP is pretty right when we're talking about top 30 wide receivers. Just like how I feel about like the top 12 quarterbacks. So when I talk about the 3 wide receivers on today's show, I want it to be known that I don't have a serious problem with their ADP. I think their ADP makes more sense than like Mark Ingram's. I just don't think I'm going to draft the wide receivers very often, which is why I'm bringing them up. The first guy is Stephon Diggs. He's on a new team, which isn't really a good thing, especially during this pandemic season. But he's going from one run-heavy offense to another, and that's also not good. The Bills have ranked 29th and 26th over the last 2 years in pass-to-rush ratio, and they've thrown 499 and 513 attempts. That's low passing volume, and that matters. Over the last 5 years, the 12th ranked wide receiver, or the lowest wide receiver 1, in each of those seasons, they've averaged 15.9 PPR points per game. Since 2011, only 4.4% of all wide receiver seasons with 15.9 PPR points per game came from offenses with 500 or fewer pass attempts. Now you may say, but JJ, what if there aren't many teams that have thrown for 500 or fewer pass attempts in a season? And that's a great question. But I'd say, well, 17% of offenses were at or below that mark over this time. So 17% of offenses had 500 or fewer pass attempts, and only 4.4% of wide receivers hitting a wide receiver 1 season in points per game came from those offenses. If you raise that number to 525 pass attempts, you'll find that 30% of offenses had 525 or fewer pass attempts since 2011. But even though 30% of teams had that few of pass attempts, just 11.5% of wide receiver 1 seasons in terms of points per game came from those teams. Some of this is because low volume in a passing attack is probably related to bad quarterback play. You don't want your bad quarterback to be throwing the ball a lot. But it's also the result of volume meaning a whole lot to fantasy football. And Diggs has dealt with that historically. He's been in the league for 5 years, and he has only one wide receiver 1 season. That came back in 2018 when Minnesota ranked 4th in pass-to-run ratio. They had over 600 pass attempts. He averaged almost 18 PPR points per game that year. He still had 14.1 points per game last year in a really run-heavy team. but his efficiency was ridiculous. Like really, really ridiculous. Among the 79 wide receivers with 50 or more targets last season, only A.J. Brown had a higher yards per target rate than Stephon Diggs, whose rate was 12.1. That was the 7th best yards per target rate over the last 9 years at wide receiver among wide receivers with 50 or more targets. And over this time, we've had 14 wideouts with a yards per target rate at 11 or better. So a yards per target rate a full yard and some change lower than Stephon Diggs last year. None of those wideouts saw an increase in yards per target the following year, and the average dip was 3.14 yards. All I mean to say here is that you can't use Diggs' 2019 production to justify what he's going to do here in 2020. The Bills are probably going to be fairly run heavy. Efficiency is going to dip, and he's on a new team. He's got to learn this new offense. Those are the reasons that I'm generally not into drafting Stephon Diggs this year. I think Stephon Diggs is a really good wide receiver, and I feel the same way about this next player, Keenan Allen. Fading Keenan Allen or calling Keenan Allen someone I'm not going to draft a whole lot this year is honestly frightening. Over the last 3 years, he's posted almost 1,200 yards per season, and he's one of 3 wide receivers to have averaged 16 or more PPR points per game in each of those 3 seasons. The other 2 wide receivers on that list, Michael Thomas, DeAndre Hopkins. But there are reasons to be down on him despite how good Keenan Allen is and how good Keenan Allen has been. I think the obvious reason is that Phillip Rivers is not there anymore. Phillip Rivers is gone. He's had Rivers in every single game over his 7-year career. So we don't know how the change is going to truly impact Keenan Allen. In each of the last 3 years, which is really the 3 years where Allen's really become a stud, he's hit a 26% target share. That's not something that happens frequently in one season, let alone 3 consecutive ones. And look, volume is a good thing. It's a sign of skill. And volume is sticky year over year. Good players get the football. But there's not much room for growth with that 26% number. So there's a higher likelihood that the number drops with a new quarterback in place. I've also got some concerns about what a new quarterback could do just in general for that fantasy stat line. Allen's had an average depth of target over the last 3 years that's ranked in the 26th percentile at wide receiver. Over his career, 18.6% of his targets have come on passes that travel 15 or more air yards. The league average at wide receiver over this time is 25.5%. So he's catching passes down the field less frequently than other wide receivers. Phillip Rivers has thrown it intermediate and deep at a below average rate as well, but Tyrod Taylor hasn't throughout his career. And we don't know what it would look like with Justin Herbert. And that's the other thing. If Herbert gets significant playing time, that's probably going to be a bad thing for Keenan Allen. My buddy Rich Rebar of Sharp Football Analysis found that of the 75 rookie quarterback seasons since 2011 where the rookie played 5 or more games, only 9.3% of those quarterbacks helped produce a top 12 wide receiver. And only 29.3% saw one with a top 24 season. I just think there are a lot of question marks with the Chargers offense. How efficient is that passing attack really going to be? Are they going to be more conservative? Some ADP sources have Keenan Allen as a top 20 wide receiver. But I would be taking Terry McLaurin and Tyler Lockett easily ahead of him right now. Maybe that comes back to bite me, but I do think it's logical. The last wide receiver I want to talk about today is Tyler Boyd. I think Boyd is someone who's a pretty good bet to meet expectation where he's being drafted. And maybe that works for a particular build that you're putting together in your draft. I just don't know if he has that much upside, which is why I'm probably not going to have a ton of him this year. I feel like people are ignoring something pretty obvious with Boyd. And it's that they'll say that he's finished as a top 20 wide receiver in each of the last 2 years, which is not wrong. But number one, he's been worse on a per game basis, ranking 26th and 19th. But number two, the dude had 147 targets last year, and he still only finished as the wide receiver 26 in points per game. That's not the most amazing endorsement of the guy. And I like Tyler Boyd. I'm a Pitt graduate. But it tells me that he's fairly volume dependent. And he's kind of been that, because huge touchdown totals aren't really part of his game. Over the last 2 years, the 2 seasons where he's been relevant in fantasy football, Boyd has seen a grand total of 6 end zone targets. There were 53 different wide receivers with that many end zone targets or more last season alone. So it's not like Boyd is someone who had a lot of targets and a lot of yards, but was unlucky to have only scored 5 times. You can easily make the argument that the opposite is true. Mike Clay's OTD metric actually showed that Boyd overperformed in the touchdown column last year because he's not getting highly valuable targets. Now AJ Green is back. Some will point out the fact that in 2018, which was Boyd's breakout year, some will point out how AJ Green seemed to help Tyler Boyd, since his points per game average was higher when AJ Green was healthy. I just don't know how much we can take away from that considering the sample size. Boyd's target share really wasn't dramatically different with or without AJ Green. I think it's hard to sell Green coming back as a good thing for Boyd's projected volume. And since he's been pretty volume dependent, that scares me. And then I can just circle back to what I just talked about with rookie quarterbacks, and you can see the concern for Tyler Boyd a little bit more. I think there's something to be said about Joe Burrow loving Justin Jefferson last year and Boyd playing that slot role for Cincinnati. Maybe they'll create some magic. I just like shooting for more upside at that point in the draft in most cases. But like I said, maybe your draft needs a little bit more of a floor play, in which case Boyd is probably a very safe bet. Just don't expect a league-winning player. The one tight end that I want to focus on today is Jared Cook. For those of you who listen to the podcast over the offseason, first off, thank you. But second, you might recall some of my talk around Jared Cook as a low-key regression candidate. I feel like not enough people are talking about what he did last year. Cook scored 9 times in 2019. Based on the amount of yards that he had and based on OTD, that number should have been closer to 5 or 6. And that ties directly to Drew Brees having a career year in touchdown rate. His 7.1% touchdown rate was the best of his entire career. And then that played into the Saints having a really high pass-to-rush touchdown ratio of 3.0. That's a number that was significantly higher than any other ratio that we've seen from them over the last 5 seasons. And that ratio regresses year over year. The Saints are almost definitely going to see a larger proportion of their touchdowns come via the ground than via the air this year. And that's going to hurt the passing attack in fantasy football. Jared Cook also had a 10.9 yards per target rate last year. The only tight end with 50 or more targets in a single season since 2011 with that high of a yards per target rate was Mark Andrews in 2018. There's no way Jared Cook maintains that pace. And then there are some target share concerns. Emmanuel Sanders is now in town. What happens if Jared Cook's target share drops? There's just a lot working against Jared Cook. Some will see him as a tight end 11 this year and think that he's a good value because he finishes the tight end 8 last year. I see a lot of good competition at the position, though, making Jared Cook someone to avoid. Now, all of those players that I just talked about, I wrote about them on numberfire.com last week. But as usual, when writing that article, I had a few other players that I didn't include that I wanted to briefly touch on within this episode. I'll be quick, but I wanted to mention them. I don't know how much DeAndre Hopkins I'm going to have. There's just so much up in the air with the shortened preseason ramp-up period. He's on a new team. And what's an alpha going to look like in that offense? I think there are enough concerns there to go for players like Julio in that range instead, or maybe Chris Godwin. I also almost wrote up Melvin Gordon. Plain and simple, my worry is competition. What if we're projecting the split between him and Phillip Lindsay completely wrong? It's tough to see a path to an awesome season if Phillip Lindsay's around. I get the allure given the position that he plays, but I just tend to avoid that range of running backs in general, maybe aside from James Conner, Chris Carson, and Todd Gurley. And then lastly is Darren Waller. The concern with him, to me, is volume. Last year, he had the 7th highest target share that we've seen at tight end over the last 9 seasons. And the Raiders added a bunch of new pieces to that offense. I just don't feel amazingly confident that he can maintain that type of volume. And he didn't have great red zone usage on the amount of volume that he saw either. I love him as a player, but I generally shy away from those middle round tight ends. It's Kelsey and Kittle and maybe Mark Andrews for me, or wait to get some of the younger, high upside tight ends. But those are the players that I'm not super into this year. I'll likely be wrong about some of them, but hopefully I'll be right way more than I'm wrong. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter, @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.